It's another canning day, and today we're doing what I think might be one of the less common things for home canners to make. I'm talking about pickled pearl onions. You know, it seems like when I was younger, you'd see pearl onions in jars all over the place at stores or restaurants or on shelves, also known as cocktail onions. People would put them in martinis or whatever, but over the last, 10, 15 years, it seems like I never see them at the store anymore. And lately I've been trying to keep an eye out. Anytime I'm at a different grocery store, I check out the canned goods and the pickle and olive section and even the liquor section to see if they have any, labeled cocktail onions. And it looks like you can buy them online if you want to pay a ton of money for a pretty small jar, but it seems like a no-brainer to me to just make some of my own. So in this video, we're going to go through every step of preparing the onions, making up a brine, canning it all up into some beautiful pint jars just like this. And I'll show you my quote secret method that is perhaps the easiest way to peel all the skins off of a million teeny tiny onions like this. So enough of the intro, let's get into these onions. Here we've got 80 ounces or 5 pounds of pearl onions. I've got half white and half gold pearl onions, though it doesn't really matter which you use, and they all end up tasting about the same. The first thing I have to do is peel all these tiny little onions. There's no way around this being a pretty tedious process, but I'm going to show you how to make it about 10 times less tedious with this one quick trick, and that's to first blanch them. So in small batches, as to not overcrowd my pot and bring the water temp down too much, I'll start dropping in my onions. I'll let them cook in that boiling water for exactly 1 minute and then immediately scoop them back out and plunge them into ice water. What I'm doing here is loosening the skins on those onions and then abruptly stopping the cooking process. This makes the peels easier to remove, but does not prematurely cook the onions within. I'll repeat these steps until I've got all of the onions blanched, and then I can move on to the actual peeling process. As I said, it's still a bit tedious because I still have to handle every single one of these tiny things. But here's how I make very quick work of removing the skins. First, I'll cut a tiny bit off the root end of the onion. Then, grasping it at the base of the stem, I'll basically just pinch the onion right out of its own skin. Then I'll come back around and cut off the bit of excess stem if necessary. For most of these, I don't need to cut any stem off, but here and there, the stem will be a little longer and dangly, so I'll just snip it off of there. And when I'm done, I've got a beautiful heap of peeled pearl onions, which means it's time to start making the brine. And by the way, in the meantime, I've got my pint jars heating up in the canner, so they're ready to go when it's time to start filling them. Moving on to the brine. Into my stock pot goes 5.5 cups of white vinegar, the kind labeled 5% acidity, followed by 1 cup of water, 2 teaspoons of kosher salt, 2 cups of white sugar. By the way, this makes for a pretty sweet pickling brine, so if you want less sweet, use half or even a quarter that amount. Then 8 teaspoons of mustard seed and 4 teaspoons of celery seed, and optionally, a tablespoon of black peppercorns. I'll stir everything together and bring it all up to a boil, and then let it boil away for about 3 minutes. Now I'm dropping in all those peeled pearl onions, and I'll let them cook in that hot brine for about 3 minutes. And at this point, we're ready to start canning, so I'll carefully empty the canner water out of my jars and get them moved over to the counter. Now using my canning funnel and this big slotted spoon thingy, I'll start filling the jars up with the onions. I'll get the jars filled up to about 1 inch from the top lip of the jars, and this batch of onions ended up being enough for about 6 pint jars. Next, an optional step. As with many pickled vegetables that I can, I like to add a little bit of calcium chloride, also sold as a product named Pickle Crisp. This just helps my onions or cucumbers or whatever it is I'm pickling to stay a little more crisp and firm during the pickling and canning process. For pint jars, I just need 1/8 of a teaspoon per jar, and I'll drop it in right over top of the onions. For quart jars, I'd use 1/4 of a teaspoon. Then it's time to ladle in the brine. I'll just fill up each jar, leaving a 1/2 inch of headspace in each one. And then I'll use my headspace measuring tool to fine-tune the level in each jar, to make sure I'm filled up to that 1/2 inch mark. Now to debubble using the other side of that headspace measuring tool. Just give everything a light stir and scrape along the inner sides of those jars to break loose any air bubbles that might be trapped down in there. Next, I'll wipe the rim with some damp paper towel to ensure that I've cleaned off any of that sugary brine that may have gotten on the top edge of the glass. Making sure those rims are very clean will ensure a proper seal between the lid and the jar. Then I'll set the lids in place, and it's no longer advised to boil the lids, but simmering them in warm water is okay, so that's what I tend to do. Finally, the metal rings. I'll screw them on, finger tight. No need to crank them down with all your strength, just make sure they're snug. Now we're moving back over to the stove, and a step I've been doing the last couple years is to take the temperature of the canner before sticking my jars into it. This canner water is still quite warm from having heated up those jars just a short while ago, and the jars are quite warm from having just poured those hot onions and brine into them. So using my infrared thermometer, I'll check the temp of the canner water as well as one of the jars to make sure they're relatively close. Sticking 2 hot jars in 2 cold water or 2 cold jars into 2 hot water is a recipe for broken glass. And since I've been doing this step, I have not had a single jar break in the canner. My canner water is 148 degrees and my jars are reading 154. So that's very close in temperature, and I feel perfectly good about sticking those jars into the canner at this time. So I'll set the jars in there, taking care not to let them touch the outside walls of the canner or one another. And I can see that I've got at least 1 inch of water over the top of those jars, which is what I want. Now to just put on the lid and crank up the heat. I need to bring this whole thing up to a full rolling boil, at which time the processing has officially begun. Once it's at a full boil, I have to process these pint jars for 10 minutes. So I'll set my timer and we'll pick it back up then. Okay, processing is finished, heat is off, and now I'm carefully transferring these jars onto a folded towel on the counter. From here, all I have to do is wait. That is, wait until these jars have cooled down completely to room temperature. And during that time, I'll expect to hear each lid pop, signaling a successful seal. As always, if any of my lids don't seal, I could put on a new lid and reprocess that jar, but generally I'll just throw that particular jar in the fridge and make sure to use it first. Failed seals don't happen often, but they happen sometimes, and they happen to everyone. Lastly, I'll mention that, as with most home-canned pickled foods, they're going to be best if you let them sit for a while before eating, anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks. The flavors really develop during that time, and I personally tend to wait about a week before popping open a jar. So there you have it. It's not especially difficult, though maybe a little time consuming, to whip up a batch of these pickled pearl onions, can them all up, and now I've got a half a dozen of these pint jars to put on the shelf and enjoy whenever I want. And I'll put the exact recipe for the brine that I use in the video description below. And be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future pickling and canning videos. And consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/Great Lakes Country. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.